Hi everyone, sorry we're a bit late starting and you were dragged away from your port and coffees and things, but what we're talking about today is the perfect after lunch drink. So you're basically continuing your lunch in here, but without the distraction of any food around. I've got the pleasure today of talking to you about aged Tawnies, which I know some of you tried to talk about yesterday, and Gustavo shut you down. So hopefully today we'll cover some of those questions that you have. As you all know, you've been here for a few days now. You've had your Vintage Port Masterclass and various of them. Port is a hugely diverse category. A lot of people, I think the base consumer who's maybe not quite so far along their wine education stage will often think of port as a ruby port style drink, but actually, as you know, it's incredibly varied. When someone says port, like vintage port, white port even, reserve, LBV, and Tawnies, the flavor profile is totally distinct. Like some will appeal to certain palates, others to others, some even just to the moment of the day or your mood in the time. I think talking about Tawny Port, it appeals to any occasion, really. I think genuinely, and you guys know more than me and feel free to disagree, but once we've tasted this, I think it's probably the most versatile pairing dessert wine there is. And as we go into tasting it, you'll see why. So when we talk about port, what makes the difference? And it's about the aging and how we look after these wines. So we often say that we make vintage ports are made in the vineyard, and Tawny ports are made in the barrel cellar or the tasting rooms. And it's largely to do with this: wood versus bottle. So as you've heard from Philippe and Harry on Monday, I think it was, vintage port is, it's the creme de la creme. We only make it 3 times a decade on average, when ultimately we're farmers. And when our crop, the grapes, are in the perfect possible condition. But inevitably we still make exceptional wines the rest of the time. And the big difference in how they evolve and how they taste in your glass is that aging profile. So wines bottled in wood, primarily in the middle ones, they start their lives in these larger vessels, and then as they age about the 5-6 year plus, we move them into smaller pipes, as we call them, vats. They impact the flavor profile of the wine. So as the wine, Alex, you can serve the wines as we talk. It's much more fun to have a tasting with wine in front of you than just listening to me talk. And do feel free to ask questions as we go along. But if you bottle a port very young, yes?
Just to get a sense of place, how large are those larger vessels? How large are they?
The ones here in this picture are probably around 20,000 litres, but as you'll see tomorrow at Graham's, like our larger vessels average around the 70,000 litre mark. And that's an important factor. So when you first bottle a vintage port or a bottle matured wine, go straight into the bottle. There's no external influence on that wine. So you retain all of those primary fruit characteristics, those like lovely plummy notes, those luscious red and darker fruits. Whereas when we move the wines to these wooden vats, initially the large ones, there is an element of contact between the wine and the wood. Really important to note that in port, we do not use any new oak, like you do with your top red wines, where you want a bit of that like peppery, spicy characteristic from the new oak, or vanilla if you're in Rioja, with the American oak. We don't want that. We only use seasoned oak staves. So the youngest barrels we'll use have at least 10 years in them. And some of the oldest staves we have are 90 plus years old. Staves being the individual bits of wood in the barrel. So when you move the wine to the wood, you've got a little bit of contact, like micro-oxygenation, which starts to impact the wine. You start to those really luscious fruits start to evolve, start to maybe turn into more like figgy characteristics. You get a bit of like spiciness, and then when you move it into the smaller barrels, the pipes, you've got a much higher degree of contact between the surface area of the liquid and the wood. And so that micro-oxygenation is enhanced, and the evolution of the wine happens at a much quicker pace. There's also a large level of evaporation, which we'll get onto. And it's almost like we planned this. The wine that Alex has poured now is a 10-year-old Tawny. So even in your first 10 years, you can see that color evolution. Like if you hold it, excuse me, but if you hold it up and you go like this, you see that those like dark ruby characteristics have really faded. You've got like a slightly orangey brown tinge around the rim, which is why we call them Tawny Ports. Tawny in English being this like lighter hue. We're not that imaginative in the port world. Ruby because it's ruby colored, Tawny because it's tawny colored. And the longer you keep the wine in these barrels, the more that color will fade, as you can see in your second and third glass on the table. So, back to your question. These larger barrels, there's less contact between the wood and the wine. Whereas as you move to the smaller barrels, the pipes are about 550 litres. There's much greater concentration. So you're speeding up that evolution. So those dark, rich, almost like toffee characteristics quickly evolve to much more nutty, almond, dried orange peel, and a bit of salted toffee. The really, really important thing with a Tawny Port is the barrel, obviously. We've made the wines, we're watching how the wine evolves in each barrel. We're making selections on, we call them lots, different years as to how each one is evolving, and maybe we need to, it's every month or every couple of weeks, we're tasting each of the wines to seeing how they're evolving, constantly following them. So as you guys know, wine is a living thing. It's not just linear. It's why luckily robots can't do our jobs yet, or yours as sommeliers, because wine is a living thing. Even how many times will we all have opened a great wine and then a couple of years later open another bottle, probably from the same case, and it's not the same wine it was. It might have gone into a little lull, it might be better, but it's not the same. And that's what I think makes it so special. And that is why with Tawny Port, we have the responsibility of aging the wines for you for multiple decades. And so we need to care for these wines in the best possible way to make sure that they evolve. And it is this team's job, the Coopers, that is crucial in that. So we're the last remaining port company with our own fully in-house team of Coopers. Tunuoid in Portuguese for everybody else. And it's truly an art that's handed down generation to generation. It's really hard work and hot. One of my cousins, I've never actually made a barrel, which I'm a bit embarrassed about. One of my cousins did a harvest in Australia, and I rang him and asked, how's it going? You're making amazing wines and stuff. And his biggest moment of pride in the whole thing was that he'd made a barrel. But in the time it took him to make one barrel, the rest of the team had made 10. So it's hard work, and it's genuinely an art. You can see in this picture here, all of the staves are labelled with a number at the top, because it's like a jigsaw puzzle. They're not all exactly the same. You take them apart, and you have to put them back in exactly the same order, otherwise it won't fit. Obviously, you don't want it to leak, and we're constantly repairing and reusing the barrels. So as I said, the youngest wood we'll use is 10 years old, give or take. And we obviously, as the barrel gets older and older, some of the staves become less reusable because they're past their life use. But the oldest staves we'll use are 90 odd years old, so we'll always try and reuse as much as possible.
I asked yesterday to the winemaker of Suzuki, when is the point, that was quite an interesting side story, when is the point that you are selling your pipes towards whiskey makers, and how does that go? So, are you reusing everything? When is there a point that you're not going to use it anymore, but you're going to sell it?
So it's a really good question. We get requests all the time from whiskey companies. It's great that there's interest, but we don't have capacity just to supply as many barrels as people ask for, nor do we want to. But Tawny Port is the biggest growth category of port over the last 10 years. Tawny sales as a sector have risen by 70% globally. And so we're having to look, if over 10 years they've risen 70%, how much more are they going to rise over the next 10 years? You've got a wine on your table here that's 40 years old. If somebody 20 years ago had decided to sell half of our barrels to a whiskey company, we wouldn't be able to make these wines. Like, we're a family business. We're having to look like a long way ahead. The wines that make up the 40-year-olds, some of them are 50 plus years old. So we can sell or give a couple of barrels a year, a few barrels a year, but we have to be very careful with what we do and keep the majority for ourselves, and particularly the best ones. But it also depends on the style of whiskey they want to make, as to the age of the barrel they want. The older the tawny, the more intense the sort of the perfume in the barrel will be, and more concentrated the wine. So just a couple of pictures, and then I put this one here just to illustrate the distinct difference between bottle aging and which is in these dark. The light's on, obviously, it's not to take the photograph, but normally in these dark caves, slightly cooler actually than the barrel cellar, where there's no interference at all in the wine, and hence why one has to decant it when you bottle. Someone on my table was asking at lunch as to how you know what needs to be decanted and what doesn't, and the trick is, what type of cork does it have, if you don't know. So, with a tawny, for example, or even a reserve ruby, we age the wine for you. We only release it when we feel it's ready to drink. We will then filter the wine, remove all the sediment, bottle, and ship. And so it's not going to carry on evolving in the bottle. We've done all that aging for you. It's not going to go off, but it's not going to carry on improving. So there's no point sticking it in a cellar for 20 years. Whereas with a vintage port, because it is bottled unfiltered, it does keep evolving. And the way to tell that is if it's got a T-top cork, like this, like the mushroom top corks, that you don't need a corkscrew to pull, or whether it has a driven cork, like a normal cork, where you have to use a corkscrew. If it's got a T-top cork, ready to go. Put it in a glass, drink it. If it's got a normal cork, you need to pull the cork, stand the bottle upright, decant it, etc. That's the trick if you're ever unsure when you get a bottle. Sorry to steal your water.
So basically, tawny wines generally, you don't need to decant them.
You never need to decant a tawny.
It doesn't, even if there's no sediment, you don't really open it up.
No. You don't need to do that at all. It's a fortified wine, obviously, but it's because it's been micro-oxidizing in the barrel, and it's probably only been in the bottle for at most a couple of years. It doesn't need that. It's got the power, the strength in the wine to open naturally in the glass.
And do you see over a few days or weeks of opening, do you see a certain evolution, a positive evolution, or not really?
Not really. But it is a good point in terms of serving. How long can you keep a tawny open once you pull the cork? Anywhere between 4 and 6 weeks, depending. The older the tawny, the longer it will have, particularly if you keep it cool in the fridge. But 4 to 6 weeks is perfectly acceptable. Because it's done that oxidation in the barrel, it has a capacity to survive for longer in the bottle. It's not a spirit. You can't come back to it this time next year. And you'll know, like, each individual wine is slightly different, but you'll know that, like, towards the end of that, sometimes it could be 8 weeks, sometimes it could be 6 weeks, but the wine starts to lose that vibrancy of fruit. You'll get more of the alcohol and the acidity rather than the fruit, and that's when you know it's going a bit flat and is coming to the end. Sorry.
Can you comment a little bit more about when you said that you don't use any oak that's younger than 10 years?
Yeah.
Earlier when we were at Maldives, Gustavo said that you're changing out individual staves. So does that mean
Yes.
that you're aging the wood before it is incorporated into a barrel for 10 years outside, inside oven kiln, or is that you filter wood from, say, Quito de Chuyo into your Tawny program by breaking it apart?
No, so it'll be it's a various different things. So your older barrels, if we go back to these guys, like when they are the computer's gone mad. When they're rebuilding a barrel or repairing a barrel, you know, if they have one that's just past any further use, they could take 2 or 3 staves from that, and maybe this one gets replaced with 2 or 3 staves that is needed. So you're recycling where possible. In terms of the younger wood, yeah, and you recycle those staves in. So we will season so we'll use old wine from our wine program now. We'll use barrels that have been used for red wine principally. And then once they pass being useful for wine, 4 or 5 years old, we will then season them, basically soak them in port, in a young port for a few years until we feel that they are ready to be used as full Tawny barrels.
Start off on the still wine program and
Yeah.
kind of move their way through the ruby program.
Yeah, some of the old ones, Coburn's particularly has a great collection of old cognac barrels that were bought, and so those were already seasoned, then maybe only needed a bit of time with port inside them to remove that sort of cognac element before we could use them properly.
And I guess you've already tried to employ new oak as experimental, I don't know, aging. What is it? I was talking about it with Gustavo before. Is it too strong even for this kind of strong wine?
It overpowers the wine. It brings in like flavor profiles that aren't good for the wine. It's not beneficial for the wine in any capacity.
All right. Either vintage or Tawny. I mean, ruby or Tawny, same thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so even like when you are making, say you make a Dow's vintage port, that is still a minimum 10-year-old wood.
Vintage port never sees any bit of wood. Bottle matured. So vintage port will only go into a bottle, never into a cask.
Isn't it legally required to age in wood for 2 years before it's bottled?
In the past, yeah, but now no longer.
Really?
So the Symington vintage ports never touch a barrel.
That's stainless steel and then...
After fermentation, it cannot have four more.
Oh, maybe in the Malveillage, for example, it might go into the barrel, but that's for a couple of days before it goes down to the lower side.
The Gaia, no more oak.
Vintage port doesn't see any oak.
So
No.
it goes Lagares straight to the bottle. Nothing funny.
No. So we bottle them at about 18 months, but we'll keep the individual lots either in concrete or stainless steel.
Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah. So it's a good point. In the past, yeah, there was this 2-year rule. So we still bottle at about 18 months where we make up the final blends, but we keep those individual lots that go into the final blend. So we identified them, we're seeing how they're evolving, but we keep them away from wood.
When did that change?
I can't remember the date off the top of my head. I'll have to come back to you.
5 years, 10 years?
It was relatively recently, yeah.
Is it being documented like by law, or is it just by...
No, it's not. The law changed that it does not have to spend time in oak anymore.
All right.
Okay.
It's quite untold business.
Yeah. Hence the Durasum camp to help educate.
Just really quickly, do you recommend serving older Tawnies at a slightly higher, lower temperature than younger Tawnies?
Yeah, you could do that. I mean, we recommend at about 13 degrees for Tawny Port. And with a Colheita or an older one, you don't need to be so cool. However, always slightly chilled is good. We're jumping around a bit here, but that's that's the whole point. It's much better when it's interactive. Alcohol is volatile. Like there's a reason that the perfume business uses alcohol for the smells, for the scents, because it's volatile. That goes onto the skin and then it goes out into the air so people smell it. The warmer a wine is, or a port, the more volatile the alcohol, because you're warming it, so you'll get a bigger hit of alcohol which overpowers the wine. Like, we're winemakers, we're not flavored drinks makers. So you don't want to overshadow all that, 40 years in the making for one of these wines, overshadow because you served it too warm and you're getting a hit of alcohol on the nose. And then you're losing all of those delicate nuances in there. Obviously, you don't want to serve it too cold because that mutes everything as well. But lightly chilled takes the edge off the volatility of the alcohol and allows the wine to really show for itself. This slide here is more for info. It's basically showing the different categories, as I mentioned before. When people often from the outside think about port, they don't understand quite how nuanced it is. And even on the top two, going from ruby to vintage and tawny up to single harvest, you've got, I can't actually count, but 8 or 9 different styles within these two bigger categories of port, which you guys have tasted some of before, and we're going to start tasting now others of them. As we go into it, just before we start tasting, and you can see this in the glasses on your table, so please pick up the 10 and the 30 particularly to the ones in your bottom left corner of your sheet, and you'll be able to see the color difference really marked on these two. So as the wine ages, the pigmentation, basically the deepness of color, fades. So with vintage, starts very, very dark, ruby colored, and then it fades relatively quickly in the first sort of 15 years, and then actually ends up at a similar kind of color to a tawny. With a tawny is much more stable evolution. It doesn't lose that pigmentation quite so quickly. But having said that, between the 10 and the 30, which hopefully you guys can see, you can see that distinct evolution. Like the 10 Dows has definitely got sort of a darker pinky edge to it, whereas the 30s much more sort of almost coppery in the end, much more sort of nutty brown characteristic to it.
A question. When it comes to color, I know that a lot of people attach a lot of value to color. That's why some quite affordable Tawny ports are oxidized, like they put a lot of oxygen in it just to brown it a bit more, so people know, okay, this is going to be a Tawny port. What is your opinion about that?
I think you need to change your port supplier.
You see a lot of the lower shelf supermarket brands do it.
Perhaps, not something that we do. I can't comment for anybody else.
Because it's not helping. I don't know, I don't have any idea about why they do it. I think it's only because of the color and like the way that, for instance, do Provence wines in a very light color. And Tawny wines just because of the sense of quality or
You're saying that to make a lighter color so it looks older. I can't comment on that. Having said that, maybe a 3-year-old tawny, like a fine tawny, has probably not gone into the smaller barrels. And so it might be lighter in color anyway because it's of lower grade quality grapes, perhaps. But
I know. They might be blending in white grapes, they might be blending in pale grapes, they might be blending in anything.
it's not to offend you in any way.
no, don't worry. I'm not offended.
Bear in mind that this is a highly regulated wine appellation, and all the categories that you have here, from a standard tawny up to a 40-year-old, they need to be approved and certified by our regulation body. So they have a spectrum of color that needs to fit.
Yeah.
Even though it's not a very narrow one, I mean, you have quite big difference of color, in each one of the categories. But at the end of the day,
Yeah, so this is a really very good point. The Dow's 10-year-old is quite dark for a 10-year-old tawny, and it's the only wine that Charles, my uncle, who's our head winemaker, it's the only wine he's ever been called into the IVDP to justify. So the Institute of Port Wine, the IVDP, sign off every wine we make, even when we change vintage or change a lot on them. We have to send them samples to tech and check that it's within the parameters. Charles got called in to the committee to justify this one. They said they didn't believe it was 10 years old. He said, and we'll get onto it when we taste the wines, but there's a reason it's this colour, is because it's more in the DAO's traditional style, but it's actually more like 13, 14 years old on average. This graph we can send you, it's colour tone, so it's basically the previous one in reverse, so I'll skip through it a little bit, because we had quite a technical masterclass this morning, which was fascinating, but maybe having a drink or two is the order of the day for the afternoon. This, though, is fascinating for the geeks in us, and you will be able to taste this as we go up. So please do have little sips back and forward as I'm talking, but you call it the angel's share, the evaporation. The angels in port are very thirsty. You can't blame them because it tastes quite nice. But the longer we're aging these wines in barrel, the higher the concentration, the level of evaporation, and therefore concentration of the wine that's left. So in your first 10 years that you've got the wine, so glass one, you've got 20% evaporation. By the time you get to 40 years old, you've lost half of the initial liquid that you started with, like 50% gone. It's madness. You can see why there are no big multinational companies in the port trade, because that doesn't look good on your P&L sheets at the end of the year, that you're losing so much liquid, so much volume from an already very dry, low-yielding region. We're losing it, but it does create this wonderful category of port that we have on the table before us. It's like these amazing concentration of flavors, this like sweet but complex with these like I said before, these salted toffee, marmalade characteristics that come out of the wines. And as you go forward, that like concentration is apparent as you go through it. It does slow down, you can see. But as you taste from 10 through to 40, you'll notice that intensity increasing. And a large part of that is due to this evaporation, but also the amount of time in barrel. And again the reverse. So I think some of you have been tasting. I think now is a good time to taste and to talk about the stylistic evolution as we go through. DAO's, where we are, the home of DAO's at Bonfim, is stylistically a slightly drier port. So we ferment DAO's a bit longer than we would do with Graham's. Graham's a bit more opulent, more rich, more lifted, whereas DAO's is probably more linear, more structured. That's slightly dry. It's got a signature peppery spice. With the Tawnies, that also comes through in a slightly almost more vinous characteristic versus Graham's. And Nicole and I thought it was interesting because we're at DAO's, to taste DAO's through, but also have the Graham and DAO 20-year-old alongside each other. I don't have glasses of the wine, so you guys can tell me what you think the flavors are. But
there's definitely a totally different nose between the two 20-year-old wines,
yeah.
Even before you put it on the palate. The DAO's feels kind of like serious and restrained.
I would totally agree with you. And also colour profile, the DAO's is a bit darker. Non facciamo.
Yeah, seriously, it's saying that whether the Graham's
feels kind of too rich. Yeah, so, well, you're I guess, giving credence to what I was saying, so at least I'm not talking bollocks. So Graham's is aged exclusively in pipes, in 550 litre barrels, the small barrels that we saw on the first screens. What do you have? Whereas DAO's is predominantly aged in balseiros, bigger barrels between 5 and 10,000 litres. So there's less leaching of the colour, less of that colour fade. You keep more of a bit more of the fruit. Obviously, being a Tawny, it's a more sort of evolved fruit style. So you might get more sort of marmalades, more toffees, mocha I often get in the DAO, whereas the Graham's is in exclusively in, sorry I'm going the wrong way, in these smaller barrels, much more, much faster evolution of the colour. We rack them every year, which is filtering as well. So they're a bit, like you said, more opulent, more open in a way. It's slightly sweeter.
And you rock every year for
With Graham, yeah.
So you have kind of not like say recipe, but kind of an idea when you get your ports which one you choose especially for vintage, which one you choose especially for Tawny, and this are maybe like I don't know, there's a party of grapes coming or wine coming, and you say okay, from the analyzers this should be kind of 40 years Tawny somewhere. So it's like I'll say on this is like or
You probably can't, you can't know 40 years, but there tend to be certain parcels of vineyard that have a greater affinity for wood and others that tend to work better in vintages. So when we're, but also every year is different. So if it's a drought year, probably the better parcels maybe come from higher up the hills. Like Fernando was saying earlier, 2022 was such a dry year. This time in 2022, we didn't know whether we were going to have any grapes to pick. It hadn't rained for almost a year. We were really, really concerned whether we were going to make any wine at all. In that year, though, actually the high altitude grapes performed quite well. So it does vary. But when the grapes come to the winery and we check the sugar levels, the acidity, etc., and we're making the fermentations, you kind of start to build an idea there of how the wine, the quality of that lot, and you mark it, and then we follow it for the following year or two, and we then select the ones that we think will have the greater affinity for bottle aging, and those for barrel. Sometimes, like I was saying, the wine is a living thing. Sometimes a curveball comes in there that you're not expecting. Sometimes a wine evolves slightly differently and you have to make changes. But you tend to, after that, be able to have an idea. And then we follow them. We're tasting these wines in the cellars all the time, working out which one is likely to be at its best now, which one still has like that structure, that intensity to have that capability to age for a long time. So it's a constantly moving feast, but you tend to, within the first few years, be able to have quite a good picture of which way a wine is going to go. The first wines on your map are all age designated. So they're age 20s, 10, 20, 30, 40 years old. That does not mean that they are exactly 10 or 20 years old. In port, it's a blend to get an average of 10 years old. So we're tasting all of these wines to see which ones will make this year's DAO's 10-year-old. It's about, depending on the year, give or take 7 to 8 component parts, different wines, to get that perfect balance, that house style. So you can play with the acidity, the sugar, get that balance. So you've got that consistency year in, year out, a bit like non-vintage champagne. It's a blend of various different years. You buy your Bollinger because you like that slightly more brioche characteristic, where you might buy your Paul Roger because you like that linear style more. It's the same or similar in port to get that consistency. So we are tasting these wines all the time because the wines that go into this year's 10-year-old, we can't use next year because they're all 1 year older. They've all evolved a little bit. They've all changed their flavor profile. As we're tasting the wines, we sometimes taste a couple of barrels that are just phenomenal right now at this moment in time and don't deserve to be lost in a blend. And in those years, in those cases, we will bottle a small amount of it. Those that are showing well might not be all the barrels, might just be 2 of them, it might be 5 of them, and we bottle them as a limited release, a single harvest Tawny or a Colheita, and that's what you've got in your last glass. So a Colheita, which means harvest in Portuguese, is a very special wine. Whilst with the first 5 wines, you've got that balance that you're able to create in the blending room. Where you can, 1 year might be a bit more, one of the component parts might be a bit more intense or younger. You can balance it to get that. And the Dows and the Grahams ones all tend to be a bit older than their age. The Dow's 20-year-olds probably more like 24, 25 years old. With the 2007 Colheita, that is just a snapshot from a single year. So they tend to be a bit more intense. And they're wines that we think are just showing really well right now. And just, it's not a commercial thing. They don't align with any anniversary or anything like that. They're just to share with you guys and the consumer this like phenomenal wine at this moment in time.
How do you make that decision if the wines are kind of an embryo? If the vintage program is never going to see a barrel, it seems like you're kind of already choosing what's going to become tawny in some form from the moments that you rack into a barrel.
About 3% of our grapes go into vintage. So the vast majority is available for this program.
So how does that, if this makes any sense, how does that decision work where you're deciding, or how do the logistics work to become something like a 2007 for you? Is that like a lot that started off that you kept together because you kept tasting it and it kept on being exceptional and singular to eventually come?
Also, we haven't bottled all of the 2000 Colheita. So when we're tasting the wines to work out, the 2007 Colheita was being tasted probably to see if it would go into the 20-year-old blend. We actually thought it was showing too well to go into the 20-year-old blend. So bottle a couple of casks, not all of them, because we still need to keep an aging program to be used further down. And we just thought it was showing exceptionally well, and we could bottle a small amount. We're talking about a couple of thousand bottles. We're not talking about a huge quantity, just a snapshot. They're lovely wines. It's all like sort of handwritten on the bottle. 2007, actually, when you talk about vintage, was a phenomenal year in the Douro. Dow's 2007 was the first vintage port of this century to be given 100 points. So it was very followed. And actually, it shows that although the aging of the wine very much influences its flavor profile and its evolution, actually those phenomenal years do tend to perform well in everything. So this has performed very well in wood. It also performed very well. Its brother in the bottle also performed very well. But you guys tell me what you think of the wines, but you could tell if you compare the 07 with the 20-year-old, which are similarly in age, they're very different wines, aren't they? The flavor profile to them is very distinct, and that's because, like I was saying before, with the aged Tawnies, we can balance all those elements to it, whereas this is just a snapshot. So there may be slightly rougher edges, but in a way that gives it a bit of charm.
But I guess the Symington family also looking for this very distinct differentiation between all the Tawnies that you make. Like, you don't want the wines to look the same, right? You want to have all different kind of characters and styles. So you have the large difference between the Dows being a bit more drier and a bit more warm, but having a lesser sweeter core.
Yes.
And for the grain, it's more succulent. It has a bit more
opulent, yeah.
Also, you got more like a caramelized, nutty kind of character to it.
Totally.
Whereas it's something that you really aim
with maybe more like marmalade on the Dows type thing.
But that's really due to blending, or does it also has to do with...
A bit of both. It's a bit of both. So the wines, the Graham's wines are all vinified in the Graham's winery, and they're vinified in a specific way to make the Graham's style. They also, less in Tawnies obviously because of the barrel, but when you're talking about the vintages, they show the terroir, the sense of place of Malverde, which often has that eucalyptus minty note. Whereas the Dows ones will show Bonfing here, and they are made here underneath our feet in the winery. Fortified longer, fermented longer, as I mentioned, to be drier, and to have this like peppery, structurally profile. And then as we age them, they age separately. We don't, there's different companies. The wines are aged separately, and then they're blended in their style as well to make this. So the Graham's ones are aged in smaller vessels. The Dow's ones are aged in these slightly larger barrels, the 5 to 10,000 litres, whereas Graham's is 550 litres. So it's a big difference. So we're very careful to preserve the historic house style of each house. These houses have Sorry. It's always really rude when your boss rings you in the middle of a presentation. We are lucky to be custodians of these houses. They have developed their house style over hundreds of years. And so we want to preserve that as much as we possibly can. To go forward.
The 20-year-old, the Dawes 20, feels like something that's working in unison, like an army marching together or something. And the Colheita is like a horse that's bolted.
Yeah. So it's got that.
It's got like it doesn't. Obviously something becomes more than the sum of its parts. So this doesn't feel like a part of this wine, but it feels like something that's just it's more energetic, but also more it's got more individual character.
Yeah, it's a bit more rustic, I guess.
Texture mostly.
Yeah, and that's because when you blend, so the Dawes 20-year-old will have multiple different wines gone into it that we're blending together. So you can balance that acidity, the sweetness, the alcohol, the fruit to get a much more rounded, harmonious wine. Whereas with the 07, you haven't got anything to balance that. You've just got that individual live thing in your glass. I really like that analogy, the horse that bolted. I think the key to making a top quality aged Tawny, like the blended Tawnies, is you have to balance that. You have to get the acidity, the alcohol, the sugar, and the fruit all in a great equilibrium. You get any of those out of balance, and you've got something that's too fiery or too jammy, and it needs to be clean on the palate, which is why I think they work really well with desserts, because you've got that acidity and that sweetness that sort of clean the palate, keep it lively. Sorry.
Looking at those evaporation curves,
Yeah.
then when you're making a finished product like the 20 or like the 40, is the thing that's preventing those sugar levels and acid levels from climbing, like they would elsewhere in the world with long-aged wines? Mm. Is it that you're blending in younger wines? Because I would normally expect if you're losing 50%, if it starts at 100 grams, that means it's 200 grams. But all of these taste that kind of parallel sweetness. Is that because you're constantly, or when you make the finished product, you have enough other product that it kind of...
So with a Colheita, you don't. With the 40-year-old, it has a balance. So the 40-year-old I don't know the exact ones for this Dawes 40, but will vary from wines that are between 50 and 60 years old to wines that are closer to 30. So you're able to balance that. But actually, although the concentration of the wine gets stronger as it slows down, the alcohol level doesn't increase. The alcohol is always fixed.
But sugar and acid are kind of the things that I noticed.
Yeah.
All of these wines have a very similar balance to them. Whereas if you taste a 30-year Marsala against a 10-year Marsala, the 30-year has so much more acid and so much more sweetness because it is concentrated in a way that these wines don't, despite the same.
So you're balancing that with the blend. I mean, with an older Colheita, you tend to have a lot more intensity, a lot more richer from that sugar. But with port, the acidity tends to stay constant, and it keeps it fresh. It stops it being too overbearing. The Graham's 74 Single Harvest Tawny, for example, is this wonderful, somebody mentioned cigars earlier, perfect wine for a cigar because it has that sweetness and that intensity, but it's also got an amazing level of freshness that just cuts through all of that and stops any of those other bits being overbearing. A key thing with Tawny Ports, and you having tasted them, and you guys being more professionals at this than I am, but with vintage, whereas you look maybe for opposites with the rubies, you maybe look for your cheeses, your fruits, etc., dark chocolate. With Tawny, similarities work perfectly. So the pictures here, your like creme brulees, your vanilla ice creams, milk chocolate, fondants, etc., all of that works really well with Tawny Port because of that acidity cutting through the sweetness and they're matching. In terms of savoury dishes, some do work very well, particularly things like pâtés or foie gras, because of the fattiness of the dish is offset by the acidity and they're quite sweet, whereas that might clash with the tannins in a wine. But it tends to be similarities that you look for. You don't need to read the blurb on it. But yeah, I'd say in terms of serving, it's where you can make or break a Tawny. So serve it slightly chilled, in the appropriate glass, never in a little thimble. You're aging a wine. The youngest wine here is 10 years old. And then you put it in a little glass. 70% of our flavor comes from our nose. Our ability to distinguish flavor comes from our nose. So why would you cut it out? You've got to let it aerate. These are tasting glasses. At home, we always just serve them in white wine glasses. And I think in a restaurant, it works really well. And it allows the wine to properly show itself to the best possible effect. It's a wonderful way in the on-trade, in the restaurant business, to prolong your customer's enjoyment. If you think that as human beings, we're quite simple, really. We often eat out to heighten our experiences, to have an enjoyable time or a special occasion, and you're greeted with a glass of champagne or a cocktail. Something makes it really special when you arrive there. Then you have this wonderful meal paired with nice wines, and then you have a coffee in the bill and you're out. It's like, well, actually, the way our memories work, when you think back, like often we remember best the beginning and the end of an experience, and the middle is obviously the most important part, but it's sort of bookended by this. So if we're able to extend that enjoyment at the end, allow someone to sit there and savor these wonderful wines, which aren't as expensive as they could be. If you think about the equivalent age from other wine regions, you're giving your customer this wonderful opportunity to have a bit to enhance their meal, their time with you, and that's what they'll remember fondly, and with their friends. And also from a probably not something you talk to the customers about, but in terms of revenue, which everybody needs to get paid at the end of the day, you're adding like extra glasses to the bill, nicer tips, all of that. So everybody's happy at the end of the day.
May I ask something about the sugar levels in the wines? Do they concentrate over time, or are you looking for what are the sugar contents, like the residual sugar?
They do go up slightly. I have the sheet, so I don't know the exact, but a Tawny tends to be the sort of the younger ones tend to be between 110 and 115 grams per litre. And then I'll need to check and let you know for the older ones. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Do you mind speaking just a little bit to although we're mostly tasting DAOs, and of course where you're sourcing the wines is a huge factor of house style. Mm-hmm. But what are some of the other steps that you take to guard those house styles? Is it like only one winemaking team makes DAOs and it's the same group with continuity? Or are there winemakers across, and how do they navigate, today I'm tasting DAOs and blending DAOs, today I'm blending grams? How do you manage those?
So we have a boutique winery, a small but very high-tech winery on each quinta. So Malvidge has its own winery just below the house. Bonfim has its own one here. Vesuvio you saw. So each quinta, each house has its own winemaking team, overseen obviously by Charles, but each one has its own winemaking team. So they are beholden to that house style in how they vinify the wines and how they make the wines. And then obviously we've got the different ways of aging that we also look for. So each house then has its own lodge in Gaia. So Graham's lodge is slightly closer to the Atlantic Ocean. It's a bit cooler than the others, and that also influences the style of the wine. Whereas Dow's is actually where our office is, into the mountain, just only a kilometre or two further up the river, but it does make a little bit of an impact. And then obviously the blending team, who do work across the different houses, but the blending team ages go from about 65 down to 35. So we're very, you've got that level of experience all the way down, so that you're able to, when you're blending the final blends, very rigorously or stick to that individual house style. But you've got all of that coming before. The lots that you're working with are different in their own. So, I think, especially the guys who've been there for longer, they would just smell a lot and be like, I know this is a Dow's one, and I know that one's a Graham's one. But then they know how to make it. Yes?
In some sheets, there was also mentioned like 50, 60, 70, or 80 years. Would you be, as a company that free that it would be allowed that you would like to say we follow 70 years Tawny, or is it because 50 years was just released, but is there a
Yeah, so
communication with the consortium, or can you say, okay,
we're regulated by the Institute of Port Wine, the IVDP, and according to the laws, well, until about 4 years ago, you were only allowed to have 10, 20, 30, 40-year-old. Now 50-year-old is permitted, which we're releasing with Graham's, which is very exciting. But you can't have, in terms of an age Tawny profile, there is no provision for a 60-year-old. 70-year-old, you can have what's called a very old port, or you have a Colheita or a single harvest Tawny, which can be older, but that is from a single year. In terms of a blended one with an age on it, that is not permitted at the moment.
and what was the reason to release a 50 years? Was there like a big demand, or did they also say, okay, we want this? Or?
Yeah, no, there's a big demand from the market. So, as I mentioned before, in the last 10 years, since 2012, the value of Tawny Port sales globally has gone up by 70%. So, huge growth. Again, to answer a question earlier about planning for the future, you've got to be planning 40, 50 years down the line with this growth. So you've got to be quite careful about how you're using wines, particularly younger ones. There's big growth in the demand for Tawny. A lot of people in the trade thought that a 50-year-old wine, we'd experimented internally, has an amazing profile. It's a phenomenal wine. The length of it would last for like half an hour in your mouth afterwards. And so a group of different producers spoke to the Institute of Port Wine, and to be honest, they were very receptive, and they agreed and thought that it would be a beneficial thing for the port category to have. So they permitted it, but then we didn't want to just rush out and, you could just blend a wine that's roughly 50 years old and release it. We thought this is really the pinnacle of what Tawny Port can be. So we wanted to take our time to make sure that what we were releasing was the best possible expression of a 50-year-old, particularly for Graham's. So the Graham's 50-year-old is actually only based on 2 wines. A wine from 1969 that was set aside for Charles when he was born by his father Peter, and then a wine that is a blend of 2 years, actually, 1970 and 73. In the 80s, we put together two wines, and actually half of that has evaporated. So it's 3 wines, but really from 2 barrels, if you get what I mean, because the first 2 have been sort of homogenizing for the past 40 years. So it's just 2 wines. It's got this wonderful freshness, this actually, the 40-year-old here, which has that concentration to it, the 50 almost has a more lifted floral characteristic to it.
I feel like the 40 is more lifted and delicate than, they kind of go that direction, but then it's a big jump from the 30 to the 40 in terms of how kind of precise.
It's the evolutions. The acidity comes through higher, doesn't it?
Can I ask a question about you? Obviously, we've seen in a couple of the wineries we've been to, and I suppose we'll see a lot more when we go to the lodge. But these beautiful old barrels, which could be 50, 60, 70 years old, the staves, and they are aesthetically they look incredible, but they look dirty.
On the outside, not on the inside.
Of course, on the outside. But is it a huge challenge to maintain like microbiological stability inside wood that is so old, or is it actually do properties?
Yeah. If you have a barrel that can kill a wine if it's tainted. So we have to. Hence, having your own in-house coopers is really, really important. Like dirty. When you say dirty, you're talking about when you're at Vesuvio and it was a bit dusty in there.
Yeah, obviously I'm being slightly like.
But there are two. So you have a point. But most of those barrels at Vesuvio are empty at the moment because the Adega is being repainted. I don't know if the painter was actually. I made a mistake. I got home last week and I found the keys to the Adega at Vesuvio in my pocket. So the poor guy couldn't go to work for 2 days.
Backstage.
Yeah, I just locked the door and I'd forgotten to do it.
But it's not that they look dirty. That was just kind of supposed to be a joke. But it's like very, very old. You know, the wood is it's probably pitted on the inside, and it's just like how wood is a natural product like cork, and it's like over.
So they've got
decades,
normally they're full of wine, so that is inoculizing itself. But when you empty it, you then have to make sure that it is suitable to receive new wine. So they are cleaned, and then, but you don't want to just, when you rack it, you can't just have a clean barrel because you don't want to, water often has high chlorine content. That's not good. So you then would rinse it with wine itself to make it ready to receive new port. So imagine if you had if you'd cleaned a barrel and it hadn't fully dried and you have some like water dampness in there, that's going to impact the wine. It would almost taste like it has TCA in a way. So
you clean it with water and some sort of product, like some sort of.
Normally just water, and then you rinse it with wine. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like wines that experience like old barrel have a kind of flavour that maybe like displays slightly differently, but you can taste it across Oloroso sherries and even like Manzanillas, and then you definitely taste it in older Banjons. Comes into Tawny Ports as well, which is right on the back of the palate, and it's like a kind of toasted hay character.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
From something aside from the aging in barrel, I think it must be something that comes from the barrel itself. The wine kind of like forms extended use. It forms kind of like a antioxidant seal. Is that correct?
So Jancis Robinson describes them as it's like a golden quality. But I get what you mean by that hay. It's quite hard to actually describe. But it's a characteristic that comes into the wines due to that aging profile that I personally think enhances them. It's sort of, it's almost like the sunrise or something at the back of your mouth. It's not.
It comes really late when you taste it's like behind, a couple seconds behind everything else. But it is like a gold. It's like a hue, like a golden hue.
Totally. Somebody who knows far less about wine than anyone in this room once I was doing a tasting and they just picked up the 20-year-old and said, "This just tastes like happiness in a glass," which I think is probably the best description of a Tawny I've ever heard.
It's very welcoming style.
It's a very universally appreciated style of port. You can see why it's grown so much recently. I don't think I have ever served a glass of Tawny Port that people haven't liked. Might not have been the right moment of the day for them to have a full glass, but I don't think I've ever had a complaint that they don't like the wine. We're very fortunate with Tawny in particular that we make a style of wine that 90+% of people enjoy. And it does appeal to a broader range of palates perhaps than a ruby style. So I think it's very much a style that is easy to serve and to suggest to customers, and it's also a style that is easier again in the restaurant trade to use because there's less of that fear of wastage, because you can open a bottle and serve it for 4, 5, 6 weeks easily. So if really, you can't sell a bottle in 5 weeks. We should probably all change jobs. Not to be, I mean, being a bit crass there, but hopefully you got the joke. The really good way to serve Tawny in the restaurant trade is large format bottles. I think where you guys are going for dinner tonight, sadly I can't join you because I've got to go for a really boring meeting, is in large format bottles, 4.5 litres, so like the size of your torso. A lot of you probably have them already in your restaurants and things, but customers see them on the side. You know, humans are vain, or Instagram generation. Pour it on one table, the other tables all automatically want to taste it. It's the easiest way to spread the love of Tawny, is show those large format bottles.
Going back a little bit, with the development of 50 or 20, is that kind of, like thinking about, as you mentioned, like wine going through kind of phases of development, do you think that 50 year is sort of like the final stage for Tawny Port? When you have stocks that are 60, 70, 80 years old, Florian mentioned, I think of like VRS sherry that might say 30 years on the bottle, but it's actually 200 years old because of the Solera system. Like, is there a world, you think, where there ever might be interest or stock for 60, 70, 80-year-old Tawnies?
Definitely. Although you can't have the exact age on the bottle, there is a category called very, very old port, wonderfully named, which allows you to have, like the clues at the names, but it is a much older style of port, so a 70, 80, 90-year-old. You can also release them as single harvests. So you could have a single harvest from, Graham's had a 1940s single harvest Tawny a few years ago, which was incredibly intense. So yes, you can. We have, and everybody in the valley has, inevitably much smaller stocks of those very old ports, so they're not going to be huge volumes on the markets, but little bits, maybe little limited editions, etc. There are those around. But in terms of, and even the 50-year-old, like we're only able to make 2,000 bottles of our Graham's 50-year-old. So again, it is limited. These are wines that we've had to set aside 50 plus years ago. That was a time when there wasn't even electricity up here. Yeah, it's amazing. It's an amazing thing. Even when I was a child, we used to have to stop for lunch to get up here because it took 6 hours to drive from Porto. It's now like an hour and 20 minutes. It's amazing that these wines that we're tasting now were made in the winery behind you with no stainless steel, no electricity, totally isolated from the world. Often monovarietal plantations, definitely in the 40-year-old, weren't really around then. So it's incredible that we are able to make these wines, and they are amazing. I think what's really special about port is that it can transport you back, right? You're almost paying tribute to the generations before you by tasting it. It's maybe it's just me, but it helps one, I think, put life in perspective, really. Like, you see all the chaos in the world. These wines have just aged happily through that. And actually, what's also lovely is in the Douro Valley, like, somebody who made the 40-year-old, or some of the component parts that went into the 40-year-old, could come here. Yeah, the tourist centre behind you, maybe not. But they'd look out and they would know exactly where they were. We still know where the dining room is at Bonfim, where we had lunch. It's lovely that although the valley is evolving and winemaking is evolving, it's still also paying tribute to the history and the heritage.
So you have a job over there, starters. What's the best Tawny Port and oyster experience you had?
Tawny and oyster.
We heard yesterday about Gustavo. Was it Gustavo?
Yeah.
Vintage and oyster with beetroot, the linking ingredient.
With what is there?
Beet reduces the link between the whole.
See, I think Gustavo goes to much nicer restaurants than I go to.
That's Copenhagen.
No, just the right people.
That's the right market.
You caught me on the hoof. I can't think. I had amazing fried oyster with Tawny, but it sounds terrible. I quite like my oysters alone. Just fresh, enhance that flavor profile. What's your best experience?
I haven't, hence I was asking.
Yeah, maybe we should plan. I think I actually not sure I have either. I'll come and visit and we can have a tasting.
I've tasted a lot of oysters with Shiraz, but that's most of them.
Oysters with Shiraz?
Yes, the plastic same side of
This is more greasy, eh?
Guys.
All the varieties of oysters have Shiraz and oysters for lunch.
As the theme of the day is kind of change and how we adapt to that change as the climate.
Yeah.
And I think it was 2 days ago listening to Harry talk about how Total, for example, is 8% of the Douro, but 25% of Symington.
Suzanne, sorry.
Plantings were 25% of your acreage in Symington, but only 8% of the Douro. And thinking about these historic wines, to your point about mixed varietals, how do you kind of think about maintaining the character when the ground is kind of changing under your feet in terms of what's planted and where it's planted and how it's planted, like how when you're now planting at higher elevations and different varieties and all these things against something like a 40 or a Colheita.
No, I get what you're saying. I actually think we're raising the bar quality level the whole time. So we're still making wines with a sense of place, no doubt, that pay tribute to it, but every year or every technological innovation along the way, we're able to make wines of a higher quality. So, for example, your monovarietals, we started planting the varietals individually in the sort of 70s and then early 80s. Because you saw from Fernando's graphs this morning, Touriga Franca, Touriga Nacional, the two hero grapes of the Douro, ripen a month apart. In the past, you'd have a mixed vineyard because some varieties protect better against mildew, others are more drought resistant, etc., etc. So it was almost like an insurance policy for the farmer, right? So you'd have multiple varieties in there, so no matter what the year threw at you, you always had some crop. But it does mean that some of the crop is picked at perfect ripeness, some of it's raisined, some of it might be green. And then you've got all those rough tannins and elements that you have to iron out of the wine along the age. You have a monovarietal vineyard, you're picking each berry. You talk about 90-year-old vineyards, it's a bit different because the vine is so mature. But monovarietal, you're picking each berry at its perfect phenolic ripeness. If you don't have any of that like rough edge to get rid of, you then got like better quality spirit, stainless steel, so you're actually making a better wine overall, but still in the style.
Do you ever worry that losing those rough edges may compromise some of the complexity of the wine over time, especially in these long-age programs?
No, I don't think so, actually. A lot of these innovations have been around for, now the monovarietal vineyards 40 years now, stainless steel again, the 80s. So I could turn the question back to you. Do you think it
was interesting when we were doing the vintage port tasting, a few of us commented that we have noticed that many of the vintage ports, not just your houses, but across the board, from the late 80s and 90s, seem to be maturing more quickly than many of the vintage ports we're familiar with from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I'm trying to kind of understand what might have shifted to create that acceleration and development beyond just opening up aging into the Douro Superior.
Interesting. Well, I don't know.
This is some 94s that, to me, I thought were much older than they were, and I was very shocked to be tasting only 30-year-old vintage port that I thought might have been 50 or 60 years old, when I tasted 70-year-old port that I thought was 20. And very privileged, I know, to have had access to those experiences, but it's still...
No, it's good. I think it's a really interesting conversation. We were at an event, Gustavo and I, recently, where we were tasting the 94s, and we play a game where everybody has to guess the vintage around the table. And most people were saying 2000, 2003. Me included. I thought it was a 97. It's still off. So we were actually doing the opposite. We all thought they were younger. And it's interesting. I don't know, to be honest. I'm not... there's obviously variation. I don't necessarily think they're evolving quicker. I don't know. I'm just talking, my personal experience with you. I wonder if there's an element of, subjectivity in terms of the age of these wines. Like when we were tasting the wines from the 70s and the 60s, they were probably about as old when you first started tasting them as wines from the 80s and the 90s are now. So maybe it's an element of like how we remember that. Like at the time, they felt like they were a long time ago. It's very easy. You serve a 94 now and people think that was yesterday. It was actually 30 years ago. So are we miss almost, is our brain playing tricks on us about the age of the wine? But actually I think what you're saying is the opposite to that. Like they actually seem older than they are.
Bottle variation is always an issue.
There is bottle variation. I actually don't know. It'd be interesting to taste. I normally find the opposite actually in my tastings that I've done, that often I think a wine is a bit younger than it actually is from the more recent years.
And have you noticed, allowing for both sides, have you noticed a change in that? The more recent vintages that have been made, I know we're supposed to be talking about Tawny, sorry about that, but have you noticed in your tasting experience more, I think, expansive than most of us in this room, that the more recent vintages seem to be aging more slowly than some of the older vintages? Is that kind of what you're saying, is that you think that as the technology has advanced, as the plantings have advanced, and the viticulture has advanced, that the wines are gaining?
Each vintage year ages in its own way. But I mean, what is definitely true is that the more recent vintages are more approachable younger. So the tannins are much more silky, they're much more integrated, so they're almost a bit more vinous in style. They're much more approachable younger, whereas in the old days you had to wait for longer for those rough edges that I meant to iron out. Do they age slower or faster? Often it's to do with where they're stored. The factory house, I'll give you a tip for tomorrow night where you're going to have to guess the age of the vintage. The factory house is renowned for the wines that are aging much slower than anywhere else, even just the other side of the river. So I think it might be to do with storage. If they're probably watching this because they always do, but the people with the best experience of tasting, there's this group on the internet called the Port Forum. If you guys are interested, you should look at the Port Forum. They have the best database of tasting notes out there, and they're always doing verticals, horizontals, everything. It's really interesting, and it's a really good way to engage with port if you're that way inclined. And they might disagree with what I'm saying, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know about that. I think, do they age slower or faster now than they used to? No, they're definitely more approachable younger. I think how it's stored and where it's stored will definitely impact how it ages. The individual year will age differently. The individual house will age slightly differently as well.
So, and I swear this will be my last question, and I'll shut up. So then, to what do you attribute them being more approachable younger? Do you think it is just that vintages are now warmer with more polymerized tannins? Is it something that you have changed in the wine?
No, it's that all of those elements that I spoke to before. So you're getting perfectly ripe fruit, no green, no raisin. You're having a better quality spirit. So when you get the in distillation, you get the head and the tail, the rough edges, and you get that central cut that is perfectly pure in a way. It doesn't have any impurities, doesn't impact the flavor profile of the wine at all. So you don't have that. You've got more advanced wine making, better knowledge. To be a winemaker now, you have to have a chemistry degree, better control of the vineyards, better control of the lodges, everything. So as a result, there aren't those rough edges. So the wines are, those tannins are like perfectly integrated, so it is approachable. You used to joke that when you tasted an en primeur vintage port in the 80s, it was like being punched in the face, whereas now actually it's like, actually you can go all day tasting them.
It's similar tasting the Großgewächs out of town.
Yeah.
It's just a slap in the face instead of a punch.
There's a restaurant in England called the Fat Duck, the Heston Blumenthal's one. It's got 3 Michelin stars, and they recently had a 2017 vintage port. Actually, they had it in 2019, so only 2 years after it. They had 2017 vintage port on their tasting menu, paired with like a venison dish or something, which was amazing that a wine that young, a vintage that everyone thinks you have to leave for a long time, was on a 3 Michelin starred restaurant in the UK. It was like bucking the trend. Actually, it was really popular.
Thank you very much for your review.
That's all right. You wanted to ask something.
I was just checking with you. You did say that the wines that are being aged at the British House, they age at a slower pace. Is that because of its altitude or atmosphere or what reason?
You can ask Charlotte tomorrow to tell you the answer. I don't know. I think it's a deep cellar. It's close to the river, so it's quite cool.
May I ask you something, because I saw that you were the market manager from UK.
Yes.
Right? How is the market changing for these kinds of ports? Also when you want to continue or you want to secure the continuation of selling ports for the future. And still, if I look at, I'm from the Netherlands, and if you look at our market is quite good on,
Very similar.
on ports. But how can we, or what is your opinion about maybe motivating or keeping young people drinking these kinds of wines? Because although, there's a lot of knowledge about it, and still a lot of more people know the differences between rubies and Tawnies, and they're more aware of what they're going to buy. But you need to maybe secure the continuation of selling these kinds of wines.
I think Tawny Port's really exciting category of port. Really exciting. It definitely appeals to that younger consumer, also to a more the female consumer who was maybe in the past port was more aimed towards the male side, whereas actually ladies often have better palates than men. So I think Tawny is a really exciting category at the moment. We do have to be careful, obviously, how we manage our stocks in order to be able to continually service the market. But it's, I think, it's something we're on top of. Like, we have a quite detailed strategy about how we age it, so we're always able to release older wines and also younger Tawnies, because the older wines are obviously phenomenal. It doesn't necessarily make them better than the younger ones. You know, each one appeals to a slightly different occasion. The older ones are much more intense and structured, whereas the 10 or even the 20 might be more pairable with some of the dishes in the restaurant, or more drinkable. Like, you can have more than one glass, which ultimately, like in the wine industry, we're in the memory creation industry. We don't directly change people's lives, but we help to heighten that experience, help them enjoy that moment in life slightly more, which I think is nice. But it's, going around the houses, back to your question, I think it's a big growth area of port. We sort of need your help to an extent to get the message to the consumer. At the end of the day, it's definitely getting there. It's growing hugely, but we're only one side of it. We make the wines. You guys are the ones out in the trenches talking to the customer every day, and it has to be a partnership. That's why working with you guys is so great. You're the ones who have the responsibility, I guess, of transmitting that message, convincing somebody who comes in who might not taste port to taste it for the first time, and then they go off as an ambassador. So if you're up for it, it's good. Anyone else?
Sorry to interrupt. We see a tendency, that's why I'm trying to, because I really love these kind of wine, but we see a tendency in the Netherlands drinking less high quality, lower alcoholic wines, even sometimes wines. Non-alcoholic drinks, cocktail-wise. I'm not struggling. I think the market in the Netherlands is quite strong for port wines, but I was curious how it was all over the world like. But it's quite stable.
It depends on the market. It's stable. So I'd say the era of cheap entry-level ports, mass volume, like €5 bottles in the supermarket is definitely declining or stagnating at best. Whereas for premium port, the top tier of the market in which these wines definitely are in your vintages is growing. There's no doubt about that. And yes, whilst lower alcohol is definitely growing, there's no doubt about that. There's also a huge, I don't know how many billion people there are in the world, but there are enough people who drink wine still and will always drink wine, particularly at the premium end. So you might not sell quite as many bottles, but you'll sell better quality bottles. And particularly if we, for these style of wines, they do appeal to the whiskey connoisseur as well, or the spirits, somebody who might be used to drinking whiskey or cognac, but are wanting to drink less alcohol. Well, Tawny Port, that's you cut half the alcohol out already. So it's very much that like aspirational premium end of the market, I think. And when I say premium, I don't mean multi-millionaires. Somebody who's prepared to spend €20 or €15 a glass. That's the segment of the market that is in growth, and I think will always be around. Well, at least I hope so. Otherwise, I've got no job. Cool. Well, thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I hope you guys found it useful. Now I'm leaving you up with your mother to...
Why does everyone call her our mother?
I don't know, because she's bossy.
Thank you.
No, none of this would happen without Nicole.
Já estamos off, certo? Né? Está a live stream?